In a quiet town, someone starts committing monstrous attacks on elderly women, and the assaults are becoming increasingly brutal. And the police are struggling to find leads to catch the criminal, whom no one suspected. Hi, you're watching the Joannis channel. Today's video is about the case that started more than 30 years ago. And this case is interesting because the person behind all of these crimes was someone who almost no one suspected. As always, if you will find this video interesting, please leave a like at the end and let's begin. This story took place in Tula in 1989. Tula is an average city in the central part of Russia. It is a rather quiet town, and there is usually not much happening. But in 1989, like in most cities of Soviet Union, there was a rise in crime due to economic problems. One day, a worker at a flour mill named Ivanova was heading to her workplace as usual to start her evening shift. Upon entering the utility room, she was shocked to find a colleague she was going to replace at her shift dead. After recovering from shock, she called the police and soon the investigative team arrived at the crime scene. The victim was 54-year-old Valentina Mukhina. She worked as a weigher at the factory. She had only a few weeks left before retirement. One might have thought this would be another robbery case, as they were becoming more common at the time. However, forensic experts were surprised to find out that the victim had been sexually assaulted. Investigators, with the help of evidence, roughly reconstructed how the attack occurred. Valentina was sitting at her workplace waiting for the next batch of grain to arrive at the factory. At that moment, someone attacked her from behind and stunned with a blunt object, possibly a stone. Later, the assailant likely finished her off with a stone and a knife. The traces of blows indicated a particular cruelty with which the attacker carried out the assault. The audacity of the criminal was striking. They were not deterred by the fact that the attack occurred during daylight when it was bright, and there were many employees at the factory. A truck carrying grain could have arrived at any moment, and the driver would have become an involuntary witness to the attack. Initially, the police suspected that the attacker might have been one of the factory workers, considering the boldness of the crime. However, none of the employees aroused suspicion, and there was no evidence pointing to them. Then the police began to lean towards another version. Soon the murder weapon was discovered. A large boulder, and most likely the criminal picked it up on the factory premises. It was possible because along the route of the grain trains arriving at the factory, thieves were stealing grain from them and replacing it with stones in the wagons to conceal the theft during waiting at the station. So it was more likely that the crime was spontaneous, as the criminal probably picked up the stone on the factory premises. The investigation into Valentina's murder lasted for about a year. And during that investigation, all of the leads were worked through, and all of the factory workers were thoroughly checked. However, no one suspicious for the police was ever found. And if the murderer had never attacked again, probably he wouldn't have been caught. But he didn't want to stop after the first attack, or he couldn't. About a year after the first murder, Albina Boldareva was walking home from work as usual. Her path led through deserted areas, mainly occupied by various factories, and the road ran among trees and a small river. Albina didn't hear as an unknown person crept up behind her and delivered a strong blow with a knife to her back. It was evening and there wasn't as many people on the streets anymore since Albina was returning home around 8 p.m. But that evening, two female workers from one of the Tula factories stayed at work longer than usual and were returning home together, following the same road Albina was on. They were shocked when they saw her lying there, severely wounded in the back. And they also saw a silhouette fleeing from her. It was the attacker who noticed their approach. These women rushed to Albina, who was barely holding on. They helped her stand up and get to the nearest road, where they called an ambulance. On the way, Albina's condition worsened, and she lost consciousness. In the hospital, doctors who examined her, apart from the wound, discovered that Albina had been assaulted sexually. On the next day, she regained consciousness, and was ready to talk to the investigators. She couldn't see the attacker's face in detail, but she provided a lot of important details about him. He was very young, wearing a knitted hat pulled down to his eyebrows. He had rubber boots with rolled-up cuffs on his feet. Apart from her description, no other clues were found at the crime scene. The police decided that once Albina will feel better, they will simply start showing her the photographs of people who were arrested for similar crimes, hoping that she would simply recognize the attacker. But unfortunately, Albina passed away in the hospital on the next night. However, what Albina managed to tell to the police became a crucial lead. The fact that criminal was either very young or looked very young allowed the detectives to really narrow down the list of possible suspects. And in the spring of 1991, the attacks continued. The next attack occurred at one of the suburban railway stations used by people to reach their country houses or to enter the forest to gather mushrooms. That day, Natalia was walking along the road through the forest from the railway station towards her home, and a man came out on the road. It was a young male walking strangely, and his appearance made Natalia feel that he was dangerous. Sensing trouble, she adjusted her bag in her hand in a way so it would be easier to hit someone with it. When they were almost near each other, the stranger pulled out a knife from his pocket. But Natalia reacted quickly and struck the attacker's hand with her heavy bag, knocking the knife out. She then fiercely attacked the stranger. She didn't yet realize how fortunate she was to escape this unknown man. Thanks to Natalia, police obtained a crucial piece of evidence in their investigation. The criminal fled, leaving his knife on the ground. Experts who examined the knife concluded that it was homemade. Natalia also mentioned that the attacker had a very strange gait. While walking, he lifted his heels very high, so it was quite noticeable. But while the police gathered more evidence and a portrait of the attacker, he didn't stop. 5 days later, a new attack was carried out. This time the victim couldn't defend herself. She was attacked from behind, apparently deciding that walking towards his victims while facing them was too risky. Meanwhile, the detectives were examining the knife that Natalia had knocked out of the attacker's hand. This knife was unusual because the handle of the knife was made from a piece of rebar to which a steel ruler was attached and wrapped with a tape. And this handle was welded to the blade using a welding machine. At that time, access to welding machines capable of such work was only available at factories. An ordinary person wouldn't have had opportunity to acquire such a machine. And now the circle of suspects narrowed even further. And soon after it, one of the investigators who was working on the case, Vladimir Arkhipov, encountered a strange story that, as he thought, might be related to the series of the attacks. One of the city residents told him that a student had attacked a teacher at one of the local schools. The deputy head of local school, Anna Kondratievna, recounted how she once had to stay later than usual when there were almost no people in school. That day she was walking along one of the poorly lit corridors of the school and noticed that someone had been following her cautiously. And it continued for some time. And this person was trying to hide himself in the shadows. Alla panicked and rushed into the school toilet, locking herself in one of the stalls. The person who had been pursuing her burst in, and Alla, in fear, screamed, thus giving away the stall she was hiding in. The stranger turned off the light and aggressively broke into the stall, attacking Alla and trying to tear her clothes off. But during the fight, this woman was able to recognize her attacker. It was one of the boys from the school she worked at. After he was recognized, the attacker got scared and ran away. Alla told about what happened to her colleagues, but with her permission, the matter was simply brushed under the rug and not reported to the police. Maybe, as it sometimes happens, Alla just didn't want everyone to know about what happened, or there's a possibility that school director told her not to report it, because they didn't want to give their school bad reputation. But fortunately, rumors about what happened reached Detective Arkhipov. Of course, Vladimir became interested in this case, because not only the older woman was attacked, but they also knew that the attacker was one of the boys from school, so he possibly could have been connected to the murders. And Detective Arkhipov decided to talk to the student as fast as he could. This student was Sergey Tsukanov. The detective decided to go to the presumed address of Tsukanov's residence. Arriving to the address, he asked a local if he knew Sergey, and this man pointed at him. Sergey was 17 years old, but he was playing with kids in the yard. Vladimir called Sergey over and immediately noticed his strange gait. But he didn't give the impression of a serial killer. He looked more like a quirky teenager who had just finished school. The initial conversation with Sergey yielded nothing, and the police conducted a search of Tsukanov's home, trying to find possible evidence. The Tsukanov family was very troubled, to say the least. Sergey was the only child in the family, and his father had problems with the law and was convicted several times during his lifetime for different crimes. And he'd been in and out of prison constantly. Sergey lived in a one-room apartment with his parents and his grandmother. The relationship in his family was complicated by the fact that all of the beds in the family were in the same room, and they were separated from each other just by small curtains. So there was no talk of any privacy in the family. And what made it even worse that Sergey's grandmother was a very toxic person, as everyone described her. She was constantly criticizing everyone, Sergey and his parents, and her reproaches against everyone provoked conflicts, and the family atmosphere was unbearable. And his grandmother was also playing the lead role in the family, and everyone were almost afraid of her. She also constantly was rummaging through everyone's things to find a reason to start a conflict. And as you understand, Sergey really hated his grandmother. And because of it, he, from the early age, started showing signs of misogyny, especially towards elderly females of full build, because they reminded him of his grandmother. But because he was so much afraid of her, he was channeling his hate to other elderly women. And apparently since childhood, Sergey also showed signs of some mental illnesses, but we don't have any records about it. But the search in the Tsukanov's family apartment yielded no clues for the police. Then the detectives decided to take Sergey for identification. Natalia, who survived the attack, had seen his face quite well, and the police offered her to conduct an identification procedure, where she would have to identify the attacker among several unfamiliar men. But at this point she didn't show the same bravery as on the day of the attack, because she thought that it was possible that Sergey could have accomplices. So on the identification procedure, she just didn't point out Tsukanov. At this moment, unexpectedly for everyone, Tsukanov decided to speak up. He himself told that he recognizes his victim, Natalia. Possibly he did this out of stupidity, or maybe he simply thought that since the victim survived, he wouldn't face serious punishment, not realizing that the police had already linked this attack to other crimes he possibly committed. And the detectives also found new witnesses. Knowing that the murderer's knife was made using a large welding machine, they visited all the factories. And 2 employees of a railroad station reported that a young man had come to them, asking to weld a knife that the detectives had shown them. These 2 men identified Tsukanov in the photograph. Sergey faced execution for 3 murders if he was older than 18 years old. However, at the time of his arrest, he was only 17. And according to law, he could only be sentenced to 10 years in prison. And that was basically his sentence after the trial ended. It seemed that the case was closed. But in 1999, 7 years after Tsukanov's arrest, someone again started attacking and killing and also sexually assaulting elderly women in Tula. And most of the attacks happened on the territory of the local cemetery. The choice of the location for the attacks was not random. Cemeteries are usually deserted, and often elderly women who come to visit the graves can be found there. The first victim was 79-year-old Anastasia Mefodievna, who was killed on August 23, 1998, by a knife blow. Her body laid in the cemetery for 4 days before being discovered. Later, 72 and 82-year-old women were found murdered in the same cemetery, and all the victims were assaulted sexually. And the attacks were carried out with particular cruelty. The police intensified patrols at the local cemetery and set up ambushes, but it didn't help. A new victim, 86-year-old Ksenia Stepanovna, was found. Of course, the detectives immediately remembered Tsukanov, but according to their information, he was serving his sentence in prison and clearly couldn't be committing murders. Dozens of other suspects were detained, but they were all eventually released. The next victim was discovered by local resident Galina Polikova in one of the suburbs of Tula. That morning she went to visit her neighbor whom she hadn't seen for some time, as this woman was mourning the death of her son. Approaching the house, Galina called out to her, but no one answered. Then she smelled smoke and ran inside to see what was happening. The door was open, and before Galina a horrifying scene unfolded. The body of her friend Nina was lying on the floor, and she was undressed to the waist, and her body was mutilated with a knife. The criminal carved different symbols, a 5-pointed star and crosses on her body with the knife. In the apartment there were still photos of Nina's son tied with black ribbons, as his memorial service was held yesterday. The detectives were puzzled who could commit such heinous attacks. Everyone considered to be suspects, especially Nina's relatives, who visited her apartment during the memorial ceremony in recent days. The list of guests was about 30 people, and when the detectives started checking all the people that visited Nina, they were shocked because they found out that, among other guests, she was visited by Sergey Tsukanov and his mother. And they began to figure out how it was possible if it was true. And when reaching out to prison, they found out that Tsukanov had been released early for good behavior. Apparently, at the time, the officers who was supposed to supervise after Tsukanov after his release just didn't do their job properly. Soon, Tsukanov was arrested and interrogated. He denied his involvement in the crimes, but after thorough questioning, he began to confess to everything. He remembered all the crimes in the tiniest detail, down to describing all the emotions he felt while killing his victims. The trial was closed. Tsukanov himself did not attend it. He wasn't brought there because, according to the expert's opinion, he posed a high public danger. The detectives who detained Tsukanov described him as a huge, strong man that was showing obvious signs of mental illness. When Tsukanov was asked why was he committing his crimes, he said that he had two personalities. One just wanted to kill and assault older women, and the other one didn't want to do it, but couldn't do anything about it. The psychiatric evaluation found Tsukanov unfit for trial because of his mental illness, and he was sentenced to mandatory psychiatric treatment. After he was sent to psychiatric facility, his traces have been lost. He will likely remain in treatment for the rest of his life, although, theoretically, if doctors declare him cured, he could be released.